If you're like me, this skin pore depth test got you a little bit jazzed for the texturing and shading portion of this project. And as much as I'd like to get right into that, there's a few more things I want to do before we commit to that phase. And it's just finishing off a few modeling tasks. Like we need a legitimate eyeball model, we need some clothes, and I also want to give him a pair of glasses as an optional accessory that we can have fun with in the render. So let's create these objects starting with the eyeballs. Now this skin pore depth test scene is meant to be exactly that. I don't intend to continue the progress in this scene because I want to show you how to add lights and set up a camera step by step. So I want to take this model back to our other scene where we left off sculpting. So we'll do the same copy and paste from this scene back to the other one. And I'm just going to, with the head selected, Alt-R to clear the rotation so he's facing straight again. And then we'll grab the eyeballs, shift select the head, Control-C, although for efficiency's sake, I will turn the viewport multi-res level back down to, let's say, 2. And Control-C to copy it. Then we'll jump back to our other Blender scene and we'll simply delete what we are replacing. So select the eyes and the head and delete. And now in the scene collection, select that, Control-V to paste it back into the scene. And we did move our head up, which I think I'm fine with because it should be sitting above the ground plane now. So if I turn on the grid floor, yeah, so it's sitting above that. I may have mentioned already that it's a silly pet peeve to model with the grid floor kind of bisecting whatever I'm modeling. So I typically like to move it above. So I'm fine leaving it here. The only issue is that the hair models need to go up too. And it's really not a huge deal because they're just proxies. But I think that's pretty close. Okay, we can turn off that hair collection. I'm going to save a new version of this scene. It's actually lesson 19. Modeling eyes, 0, 0. Okay, let's talk about eyes. I think, yeah, we can use this reference image. Let's maximize it. And realistic eyes is something I neglected for a long time. I think just because I took the easy way out and assumed that it could be achieved by kind of plastering a photograph of an eye onto a sphere. And of course, that's nothing like what a real eye is. Whether you know how to describe it accurately or not, every human is an expert on the eyes, at least in terms of how they look, because eyes are crucial to how we communicate as a species. And so it's very important that we get these right. And I'm trying to find a good example. You know, you might have really dark eyes and they almost look black. Dark brown is very common, but then you get into blue eyes where they're obviously lighter and you see the light interaction happening. But in general, there's this kind of gem-like quality to the eyes. And when I say that, I'm really talking about the iris. The eyeball itself, in terms of shape, is basically a sphere, but when we get to the iris area, there's some important shapes to capture. Now, I'm trying to find a good eye example that really illustrates the gem-like quality, because it's usually caricatured in stylized visuals, like an animated character's eyes, where there's a distinct gradient. And this is what I'm looking for. So you can see here there's a gradient in the iris where it's darker on the upper side of the iris, and then it gradually gets lighter towards the bottom. And this is something we really want to be able to achieve in our renders. And this happens because the iris area is not flat, nor is it just one surface. It's two surfaces. The cornea is the clear part, which is reflecting the light, but also letting light pass through to the second surface within the eye, which is the actual iris disc. And so there's some space between these two surfaces that allows for a shadow to be cast, most commonly on the upper side if the light is coming from the top, and then the bottom half of the iris disc is being illuminated more. So that's where this gem-like quality comes from, and it's important to how we model our eyeball mesh. So now that we've analyzed a photograph of eyes, let's do our due diligence in terms of scientific information. We'll jump over to trusty Google, and I'm going to type in iris anatomy. So iris anatomy is a simple term to search, and I'm going to look up the Wikipedia article. I trust Wikipedia. It's never really led me wrong yet. I'm sorry if that drives you crazy, especially if you're a professor type. But we do get this excellent schematic diagram of an eye. And here you can see more what I'm talking about, how the iris portion, this green disc, is really a separate surface from the cornea. And the cornea changes the eyeball from being a perfect sphere, or, well, it's not a perfect sphere, from being spherical to having this noticeable bump where the iris is. And in terms of our model, this means we're going to have two mesh islands within the same object. We're going to have an eyeball object, which is the sphere plus the bump of the cornea, and then a separate mesh island for the iris disc shape. And we'll have a hole in that representing the pupil. And when that renders, the inside of the eye will just be black. In case that's not the truth, we can always add a piece of geometry that's pure black. So this is an excellent diagram for guidance. But I have a specific question. We know that the iris disc is smaller than the eyeball, but how much smaller exactly? Can we find that information easily? Is that measurable? Let's add a new Chrome tab and just ask that question. Iris size compared to eyeball. I don't know if that's the right terms, but okay, so we do get a pretty good set of results. At the very top, the average size of a human eye is 24 millimeters. The iris is about 12 millimeters. So that's half. That means the iris is simply half the size of the eyeball diameter. This is coming from CG Society, so this is an artistic 3D website, conveniently enough. So, I mean, that's pretty trustworthy, but you're also kind of trusting someone like you, another artist seeking and posting this information. So I like to try and find a medical source if possible to at least cross-reference this information. Let's see if we can find anything else. The second search result is from Quora, which is a very common question answering site. Let's see what that has to say. Answered by a consultant ophthalmologist. That's good enough for me, in that this person probably knows a little bit more than a CG artist. So let's verify the information. The diameter of the eye globe. Okay, so the eye globe is maybe a new term that we can search for if we want additional information, which I did not know about. Ranges from 21 to 25 millimeters, so 24 fits within that range. And then some additional information, I think, presenting that the eyeball is not a perfect sphere, but I'm not worried about that. I'm going to keep it spherical. And then the diameter of the iris also varies from 10 to 13 millimeters. Okay, so 12 millimeters is actually on the higher end of that range. So practically, what does this tell me as an artist? That the iris is basically half the size of the eyeball diameter, with a little bit of wiggle room if I want to make it smaller or larger based on how it appears to me. So that's what we're going to do. Let's apply that information. We might as well start from the proxy geometry. Where is this located? That's right, it's parented to the head mesh, which is fine. Let's go to local view. And we've done a little bit of the legwork already in that our sphere object was set up to have these edge loops face in the direction that the eye is pointed. That's very convenient. That is how I recommend modeling this setup. And now the first thing I want to create is the the iris disc. So we can simply select any of these edge loops, Shift D to duplicate it, right click to cancel transformation, make sure we're scaling by the median point, and simply hit S.5. Okay, so this makes our iris disc half the diameter of our eyeball. All right, now I want to move this according to local axes. So with the default set at global, I'm going to be sure to hit GYY so that we're moving in the local y-axis. This will keep us oriented properly within the eye. I'm going to move this iris disc, let's see, close to the front. All right, I want to leave a little bit of space so that we're not intersecting the eyeball, which is called the sclera. And that looks to be positioned pretty well. All right, let's hit Shift H to hide everything but our iris disc. And now I can hit E, which I just realized I do not have screencast keys on, so let's turn that on. And yes, I can hit E to extrude, and I'm going to do simple modeling, gradually reaching the center where we will have a pupil about this size, something we can adjust later. Now let's take one more look at our diagram to see if there's any nuanced shapes going on within the disc itself. And yes, it looks as if, based on this image, which is a drawing, so, you know, it's helpful, but maybe it's not perfect. It looks like the hole where the pupil is actually kind of raises up, like a really shallow volcano almost. So let's implement that. So I want to hit G, Y, Y to kind of move it slightly up so we get this kind of curve. And then we will E to extrude, making sure to stick to the local axes. E, Y, Y, give it a little bit of thickness. And then according to that diagram, I feel like we need to extrude back towards the boundary to kind of give it a nice rounded off rim on the inside. So E, S, I think that should be good. All right, so we'll select everything, Shift in to recalculate normals, right click, shade smooth, and then Control 2 in object mode to give it a subsurf modifier, so it's smooth. And then I'll go back to, let's see, edit mode, and make sure that we can see the effects of the modifier in edit mode. Turn off overlays. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. Only other thing I might do is extrude the outside and kind of move it down. Something like this. To kind of round over the exterior boundary of the iris. Okay, so that's going to be good for the iris disc. Now for the bump of the cornea. Let's Alt-H to bring back our eyeball geometry. And again, thanks to the convenience of setting up this proxy, we already have an idea of where the bump needs to start, but let's go to wireframe view and make sure that that corroborates with the disk we just created. And yes, I think it does, because if we go back to our diagram, the bump, it's very subtle, right? It's not a harsh line where the bump starts. So it gradually starts to come up around the boundary of the iris. All right, so if we select the pole of our sphere and then grow the selection out a few edge loops, G, Y, Y. Let's see, I'm actually going to, I think, start the bump a little bit sooner. There we go, something like this. Okay, so this edge loop represents where the bump starts. And then a problem we have is this triangle fan. Now, if we try and render that with a very reflective, clear surface, which is what the cornea will be in the end, we will see a shading artifact from this triangle fan. So we want to get rid of that. It's not ideal. You could get away with it if you were in a pinch, but it's not the best option. So I'm going to remove this vertex and hit the spacebar key, which I have set to be the search function, by the way. And I'm going to look for grid fill. And that works nicely because our sphere is an even number of edge loops. And so the default span of 8, and then I'm just going to rotate this around so that we get a perpendicular grid according to the axes of our object. And then with that selected, I'll go to Vertex, Smooth Vertices, and hit Shift-R several times. All right, so we're going to want to smooth that out. The problem with this is instead of one triangle fan pole, we now have 4 poles, which I know from experience is making some of you cry out in pain. But don't worry, we're going to solve that to a point of not being able to notice it. And the next step is I want to give this more of a dimple shape because just smoothing the verts still keeps it relatively flat. So I'm going to select that central vertex and grow out until I have this patch selected, and then Shift H to hide everything else. Now select just that central vert and then enable proportional editing. I'm going to turn off connected only. The smooth fall off should be fine. And I'm going to hit G, Y, Y, remembering to keep it local in terms of the axes. And let's see if we can find our circle. So I want it to be fairly large. All right, actually about like that. That's going to give me a nice smooth fall off. And I'm just going to give it more of a dimple, maybe err on the side of too dimpled or too rounded rather than too flat. All right, that looks fine. Alt-H to bring back the rest of our eyeball mesh. So now we've got this pretty strong dimple to the cornea. Let's see what it looks like in our diagram. And it is pretty noticeable. It's not a small dimple. So I'm going to take kind of a mental snapshot of this, compare it to our Blender scene. I do think this is a little bit too strong at the moment. So what I think I'll do is add one more edge loop to make sure that this stays perfectly circular. And then I'm going to smooth the verts right here. So vertex, smooth vertices, incorporating that previously perfectly circular edge loop. All right, so the idea is just to try and smooth this dimple out as much as possible. And then if it's too dimpled, kind of pushing out too much, we can turn off proportional editing and scale in Y locally. All right, I think that that's going to be pretty good. Let's get rid of our materials. They were just temporary, and now they're kind of more distracting than helpful. So when we turn that off, we can see that the dimple of the cornea looks pretty good. You can see the poles showing up, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, just kind of annoyingly creating these pinches. But also there's a too noticeable ridge where the cornea bump starts. And so we can smooth that out a couple ways. Let's see, I've got so many panels. Let's get rid of this panel. Let's just go back to 1 for now. I can always add them later if I need. But we'll turn off subdivision. Okay, and that reveals exactly what the problem is. So we can smooth this out by sliding our edge loops. And actually, I might not need this anymore. So in edge mode, Control X, then kind of bring these together. You want to make sure that your edge loops are spaced pretty evenly. Of course, if they're uneven, it's going to introduce some pinching in the subsurface or just some tightening of edges in the subsurface. All right, let's see what that looks like. All right, that looks a little bit better. Now we're left with only the dimples, and I want to show you how we can fix that. First, let's make sure we can tell just how bad the dimples are, and I recommend switching to this car paint matte cap because it really makes it evident where those are. And so tabbing into edit mode, I'm going to grab the poles and then switch back to proportional editing and choose the sharp fall off. Okay. Now, if we Alt S and push these in, you'll see what I'm doing. I'm actually pushing them out to illustrate. We're grabbing those poles and smoothly pushing inward. That's what we want to do. And so if we go in, let's dial down the size a little bit. Also turn off overlays so we can just see the final result. Alt S, pushing those in. If you strike the right balance, they basically disappear by pushing them in a little bit. Yeah, I think that's going to work great. All right, let's go back to wireframe view, kind of reassess the dimple. You know, I don't want a strong ridge where the cornea starts, but I do want it to be slightly noticeable because that's the way reality is. So, oh, I turned off my overlays. Okay. GYY, we'll move that down slightly. Okay. I think that's going to be good. Well, too strong, actually. Okay. That's going to be good, especially for now. Once we get to the material, we can, of course, adjust this stuff to make it perfect. But anatomically, this is a much more realistic eye than a simple sphere. It's not even comparable. So if we go back to a more neutral matte cap, this should work out quite well as an eyeball model, or a legitimate eyeball model, I should say. Now, I'm realizing that I must not have been smoothing the proxy geometry for the eyeballs, because now that it's smoothed, we're getting a gap, which actually we were getting a gap before. The gaps you want to eliminate. You want to mind them. You don't want there to be gaps between the eyelid and the eyeball. That's going to be an obvious sign of unrealism. So let's move these around slightly, maybe scale them up. Just try everything we can to eliminate those little gaps. I am scaling the eyeball up a little bit. Okay. I think we've eliminated the gaps, but we do have another problem. That bump in the iris is not compensated in the eyelid, so we get this intersection, and we want to eliminate that as well. So let's go back to our head mesh, and in the shape keys, I should have a shape for fixes. All right, so I'll select that, and we want to make this to the base geometry, not our multi-res sculpt data. So with that selected, Let's go to sculpt mode. And let's take our sculpt value down to like 3 and then enable sculpt base mesh. All right. This means we are sculpting in the shape key, not on the sculpt data. I want to lock the Z-axis so it's not pushed up at all. I'm just going to bring this out. Oh, also undo that and enable X symmetry so that we get it on both sides for free. I mean, we get it on one side for free. All right, so pull the eyelid out. There we go. Excellent. Back to object mode, and we're done with the eyeball. Just make sure to save the scene, and we are in good shape to add that material now. On to the next model.